Oh, and hello, Michael. So let me get started. Let me first introduce Slavenka Drakulić, who I am thrilled to be able to introduce. I would be even more thrilled if we were actually seeing everybody in real life, but given the constraints of the present situation, we are seeing one another in the ways that we can. I know that many of you, probably most of you, know exactly who Slavenka is, but I am going to introduce her anyway. She was raised in communist Yugoslavia. She is coming to us from Croatia. She also lives sometimes in Sweden and sometimes in Vienna. She has traveled extensively in other places, including in Britain and the United States. And part of what informs this book has to do with the fact that growing up in communist Yugoslavia, in a communist country that was not part of the Soviet bloc, there was relatively more freedom to travel. Um, she has done many interesting things in her life. I will just mention a couple of them, one of which was to interview both Abby Hoffman and Gloria Steinem um, back in the day. She has written many books. She's extremely prolific in both Croatian and in English, and they have been translated into many different languages. How We Survived Communism and Even Laughed, The Balkan Express, Café Europa, a guided tour through the Museum of Communism, fables from a mouse, a parrot, a bear, a cat, a mole, a pig, a dog, and a raven. Um, a couple novels, which are very striking. And I know that many of you who I've scrolled through the list have read them. Some of you I know have read them more than once. The Taste of a Man, and a novel called S, a novel about the Balkans. Um, Let me maybe just briefly mention the guided tour through the Museum of Communism book with the animal fables, because I particularly like it. And because it's animal fables, academics might otherwise miss it because it might not sound particularly serious. But in one of the stories, Bohumil the mouse is talking to an elderly cleaning woman, Milena, who says that people don't come to visit the museum because they don't want to think about the fact that they went along with it, that they complied, and not only in order to survive, at least not in Czechoslovakia of the 1970s and 1980s, but just to live better. Slavenka has written about, besides mice, ravens, parrots, bears, and other creative animals, communism, the horrors of the Yugoslav wars, of rape, of ethnic cleansing, the disappointments of the post-communist era, wild dogs roaming around Bucharest, a Polish poet who falls in love with a Brazilian anthropologist, a Bosnian rape victim who discovers she's pregnant with her rapist child. There's really an extraordinary range here. And one of the things I hope that we can talk about today, because I know a lot of you in the audience are academics, not all of you, a lot of you are specialists and write about Eastern Europe from different perspectives, sometimes more theoretically, sometimes more empirically. But I'm going to ask, I think, mainly Slavenka to talk about today, both in connection with her new book and and more generally with her work, about her ideas that things like wars and revolutions are seen in small everyday things, that beneath great political drama lies concealed individual human lives. Um, One of the books that I made my students, or had my students go back and read, well, not go back for them, perhaps go back for me, during the Trump era, was an extraordinary book she wrote about the war crimes trials at The Hague, of war criminals from the wars of ethnic cleansing in Yugoslavia. It's called They Would Never Hurt a Fly, War Criminals on Trial at The Hague, and was published in 2008, and unfortunately still speaks very much to our present moment. Slavenka is a journalist and a novelist. She's a feminist and an anti-nationalist. She's a kidney transplant survivor. She was in Sweden when coronavirus struck, And we are extremely fortunate to have her with us because she just barely survived. And she wrote an extraordinary, very moving and very illuminating essay, which maybe Christina can send the link to, called Surviving COVID-19, which was published in the Yale Review, and you can pull it up online, which is really about coming back from the dead. And what it means to come back from a period of near death and unconsciousness and return to life and return to your body. Okay, so now I'll start with the book that has just come out about post-communism. It is now 30 years later. This book is called Café Europa Revisited: How to Survive Post-Communism. It's 30 years after the fall of communism, as you all know perfectly well, I guess 31, 32 years at the moment. And it's the moment when we're beginning to look back on post-communism as a historical period. 30 years is a critical mass of time. In a lot of countries, 30 years is the minimum time after an event when you can begin to look at archival records. So in some sense, something officially becomes history after the 30 years have passed and those archives open. It's a moment of taking stock of the present moment. What has worked, what hasn't worked, what were the successes, what are the failures, where are we? There are two big issues, I think, in the book that kind of run through these different chapters. The first has to do with what does it mean to join Europe? What does it mean to reunite Europe? What does it mean to integrate Eastern Europe? And the second has to do with what I think Adam Michnik sometimes calls the utopian capitalist package. This idea that communism fell and the wicked witch is dead, and we are now at the end of history, liberal teleology of progress. Fukuyama, everything was going to be happy. We're all going to live happily ever after. We're going to have liberalism, democracy, and the free market. Nobody at the time seems to have thought about the ways in which those three things might not necessarily go together in some kind of seamless, harmonious way. They were supposed to go together in a seamless, harmonious way, and we were all supposed to live happily ever after. And of course, somehow things turned out otherwise, and we haven't all lived happily ever after on either side of the Iron Curtain. In some sense, I think only now, belatedly, on both sides of the Atlantic, we're coming to terms with this second version of Hegelianism, the second Hegelian bite, not the one that leads us to communism, but the one that gave us a sense of utopian liberal democracy. So maybe I will start by asking Slavenka. I would like to, wait, somebody has a question. Is there a technical problem? Is anyone else having a problem with echoing sound? I'm going to let Christina take that question because I can't hear.
I'm not hearing an echo. Sorry if that is happening. It might not be for everyone. Sorry.
Okay. I'll let Christina work on that. One of the things I also wanted to ask Christina to talk about, because to ask Slavenka to talk about, because I know that there are a lot of people in the audience who are students and graduate students and are thinking about writing as well, and how they want to write and what it means to write. So my first question to Slavenka is going to be, why did you decide to write this book now? How did you come to the idea, and why did you feel like it made sense, having looked at how we survived communism, to go back to that motif and ask ourselves now, here we are in the 21st century, what does it mean to survive post-communism?
Well, first, let me greet everybody, whoever is in this virtual room, and then thank you for this wonderful introduction. And because it's always interesting to hear how other people talk about you, or gossip about you for that matter. And then I'm thinking, she talks so nicely, maybe she should continue. Why should I say anything? You said so many things. Well, but it's not possible, of course. So back to the question. The question, well, the answer is rather simple. I see it as continuation. I see it as you said, I'm writing all kinds of things from many angles. Maybe this is confusing because there is fiction, non-fiction, there is journalism, there is everything. But such is life. There are so many things in life that you can't miss. So, but focusing on this, the reason is that, what was it, some 25 years ago, perhaps, I wrote a book called Café Europa. This is why this Café Europa Revisited. And because I, from looking from below, looking from the frog perspective, I was trying to see how everyday life looks immediately after 1989. But at that point, you don't see so many things. I decided for a cafe because I think cafe is a typical European institution. It is a coffee place, but it is not like a bar. It's not like a, I don't know, it's something where you can sit and read for a long time, where you can receive friends and eat something a little, perhaps. And it's a very nice institution, disappearing, of course, like everything else. So revisiting Café Europa means for me seeing how much things have changed since I have written that first book. And what we didn't see then, and what I didn't see then, and what I believe at that time, perhaps more than I believe now, is that there was an expectation and also belief that once things have changed, democracy, freedom, capitalism, and all of that, that it will work somehow differently. You mention a few things that are going to be better. But, we have this dream about things being better immediately, like, you wake up in a bigger apartment, the sun is going to shine every day, you are going to be paid better, you will get a better job, your wife is perhaps going to look more beautiful, or your husband. So it's a kind of too many expectations. And then we made, I think, another mistake, I think all of us, including whoever was looking into 1989, that this is an event, not an earthquake, not a real revolution, but I call it earthquake. It means that a long time after the ground is shaking, long time after everything is changing in a big way first, but then in a small, minute things that you do not see immediately. Indeed, if something like a collapse of one regime, one political regime, one economic regime, one way of living disappeared, it cannot be sudden. You can change political regime overnight, of course. Economy, well, it takes some time, but there is something what I call mentality, which does not change so quickly and so easily, because it actually goes with generation. You mentioned one generation grew up, several of them, but actually, and 30 years after, this is already history. Yes, but there are still people who are belonging to that generation, and that generation that is a little bit older than me, including my generation, are actually losers of this whole big change. And their perspective of post-communism is completely different from the young people. It depends when you were born, but basically you have different values. You grew up in a different way if you're younger or if you're older. And if the 1989 cut your life into when you were, let's say, 55 or 60, then your life has been pretty much changed. And what you could expect, and most people experience, was not so glorious and not so beautiful as people expected it. So there are many things that I didn't then took into consideration. So I thought, well, okay, let's see again what has changed, what hasn't changed. Many things have changed, but many things haven't. And then I was kind of I was really picky. I was looking at the small things, like, for example, food. Who would look into food? I mean, why is food? I consider it a very important part of the book, the story about.
Wait, can you tell, I'm sorry, can you tell them briefly the story about food? Because I had, until I read that, I never, ever would have guessed that was true.
Yeah. Well, at some point, a couple of years ago, people started to complain about the content of the food of the same company producing the same, little box with fish sticks or with yogurt, or Nestle producing chocolate or something like that, or what is it called, Nutella, and these kind of things. There was at the end they made to test about 30 different products to test them east and west. For example, in Slovakia and in Austria, they test differently. And people started to wonder why. First of all, they went across the border to buy this product, the same product. But if you notice that the yogurt in Vienna has more fruit and in Bratislava has less fruit, then you really say, okay, I'm going to buy it, but why really? So somebody started to look into these small letters that you never look into, and then realized that, for example, there is indeed less fruit in fruit yogurt, that there is less chocolate in Nutella, that there is less fish in fish sticks, and so on and so on. There was a whole list, that the Coke tastes differently in different countries. How do we call this? Café, coffee, instant coffee also tastes differently. Well, then somebody started to look into that seriously and discovered that indeed there is a difference. Of course, the producers came with an explanation, and then explanation make it even worse, because explanation was, we are not denying that it is different. Yeah, it's different. But the reason is that because people in those countries, they are consumers, they pay for that also. It's not for free. They are used to this, to less fish in a fish stick, to less chocolate in chocolate, to less this or that. I mean, this is actually humiliating. No? So there was then let's say the political process started in making this, investigating it. There was a group, women, mind you, who came together from Slovakia, from Croatia, and so on, and they formed a kind of committee that looked into that and then proposed the law, and then later on the law was passed. The story tells also many side stories and so on, but basically it was one of these, and this is what I'm interested in, one of these small signs of how people are still different, and how their experience on the level of food is different, and how you can actually be humiliated on the level of food. And I thought it was, to me, it was very interesting. And I also, like you, never pay any attention or experience that until it was made, I was made aware about that.
No, I thought of all the years I've spent, on both sides of that Slovak, Austrian border, and I had never noticed. But I think I had never noticed because I would never buy Nutella, and I would never eat fish sticks. So I think I had missed these things.
But you would buy fruit yogurt maybe, or fish
that's
sticks.
true.
You don't like fish sticks, so.
Well, my son likes. Caleb now eats fish sticks.
But for example, there are other products like washing powder, washing liquids.
Yeah.
I didn't believe it. I was totally shocked. And here in this small part of the world, in a small town here where 2,000 people live, I go to hairdresser and she tells me, not now, even 5-6 years ago, that she doesn't buy washing powder here. We are like, I don't know, half an hour drive from Italy. So she goes to Italy, buys washing powder. Why? Because washing powder produced in Eastern Europe, the same Ariel, the same whatever they are called, Persil or whatever they are called, they do not have the same quality. They are not strong enough. They are washing better those produced in Italy. And the explanation was, I find it really very funny. Yes, we do weaker powder and liquid. But why? Because people in Eastern Europe, they put much more powder in their washing machine. Hello, I mean, please. How do you know that? I mean, did you make research about that? So it's these kind of things that actually make you, you know, apart from other bigger things, but this makes you angry. And I think Ivan Krastev wrote a book about it, about you know, how people in Eastern Europe, after so many years, started to feel humiliated, started to feel as they are not al pari with Westerners, and that they are, in fact, looked down upon.
So let me, I love this topic about food, but I think there's some historians in the audience. So I'm going to ask you some perhaps more serious questions, or questions that more people are working on. A lot of this book has to do with explicitly or implicitly accounting with the past, which has been a topic since 1989, but in some ways it's only intensified as opposed to weakened as the years went past. And one of the things I was thinking about as I read this is the extent to which Yugoslavia is a very special case. You know, if Czechoslovakia had the Velvet Revolution and the Velvet Divorce, and Poland had the Round Table Talks, and everyone was looking to the happily ever after, you had these bloody, gruesome wars of ethnic cleansing in the 1990s. So you didn't have that happily ever after moment, you know, in the 1990s that other people did. You had the kind of gruesomeness that in other parts of Eastern Europe are associated with the middle of the 20th century and not the end of the 20th century. And some of the things you wrote about war in that book, like at the beginning of a war, you still remember the first victims' names. The first people to get killed, you remember their names. And it was true on the Maidan too. The first people who got killed, you remember their names, and then the numbers get too big, or you think it won't touch you, you know, and then of course, inevitably it does. And you've written a lot about that war. And you know, one of the things, I'll just read this short quote because I wanted to read it to Americans, you know, during all those years of Trump. It is essential that we understand that it is we ordinary people and not some madmen who made it possible. We were the ones who one day stopped greeting those neighbors of a different nationality, an act that the next day made possible the opening of concentration camps. We did it to each other. If it is true that there is no collective guilt, can there be collective innocence? So these questions about collective guilt and collective innocence that have been at the center, for instance, of Polish politics, of polityka historyczna, of historical policy, that go back to the Stalinist era, you know, and the Nazi era, they're present in Yugoslavia in a temporally much closer way. You know, there are many more people still alive who have gone through that personally, you know. And so as we get into this idea of accounting with the past, I wanted to ask you to reflect on the way in which that conversation has been somehow particularly loaded in a place in which there are people who are implicated. Not only their grandfathers are implicated, or they were implicated as very young people, but people who were implicated not so long ago themselves in their own lives.
Well, I see in your question, I see two questions. One is the history and memory in Eastern Europe, how we deal with that, and the other is war and how we are still dealing with that. I think throughout Eastern history there is, and I will now, for all these historians, all these, I hope many historians and students who are present are, I will simplify, really, really simplify, because we have no time to go into details, but I promise that the book is a little bit more complex. So in my opinion, what happened is that I see it as if suddenly, not suddenly, but as a consequence, of course, of a change, big change, earthquake, those regimes that came, the political change brought something else. And this is as if all those new, fresh governments, post-communist government, tried to do one thing. And it's, to me, fantastic, astonishing, as if they tried to make a bridge between the present, democratic present, and bridge over communism to the past before communism. Somehow reinterpreted, if possible, hiding, if possible, erasing, if possible, changing or communism, as if it did not happen. Those countries who had like you mentioned Czechoslovakia, who had some democracy, okay, but what other countries did go to? They go back to feudalism, everything but not communism. So this kind of bridging, this kind of revisionism in the case of some countries, like for example Slovakia or Croatia for that matter, the countries who were fascist during the Second World War, took place. And it has to do, and this is why this question is very, very big and complex, it has to do with the fact, one of the first signs that Eastern Europeans feel uneasy was that they started to talk about their national identity. And parallel with this bridging, let's say, that this phenomena of awareness of talk about national identity, and I would say also rights of nationalism, not only in Yugoslavia, but in the other countries too. And another element which was apparent and very important is the importance of the church. So you all know communism, church, and so on. So the church now started to have a very big influence. Why? Because church was, during the time of communism, so to say, a keeper of national identity, of the language and of the national identity. And now it started to play more and more role. The role was conservative, as it is to be expected, of course. Now, this is, I would say, one question, and it is not still resolved. Why? Because during communism, we had another problem, and this is that we did not, I remember from school, we didn't have history. We had the official history. Okay, there was a history, but there was official version of history controlled by the Communist Party. And we had memory. So this gap between history and memory was always there underneath, played an enormous role in these identity discussions. And it's not resolved until now. There is still difference between history and memory. Why? Because nationalist governments, like for example, again in Croatia, but in Serbia, in other countries as well, in Poland, if you want, are trying to again create official history. They would like to control it in this way, by bridging, by taking out, by rehabilitating the past, by saying, I don't know, I mean, for example, Poland has a problem with Auschwitz. We have a problem with another concentration camp during the Second World War called Jasenovac, and so on and so on. So there is this reinterpretation in this bridging, you know, and especially in the countries who were at war from former Yugoslavia, this creation of a new official version, again against the personal memory, because, and these two never managed, still did not manage to come together. This is, let's say, one side of the question. Then when we come to the war, of course, everything becomes much worse. I would not go into details of the war in the sense how it started, why in Yugoslavia, because that's completely, it would take us very far away. And I wrote 2 books about that, so I can't really somehow summarize it. But what I have noticed now, and I think a part of that is also in the book, that this nationalism, it could not, 25 years after the war, did not disappear. It is still there. We still have nationalist governments in respective countries who were at war, and it serves one purpose, two purposes, I would say. One is to keep it on the low fire, to have it handy there when you need for something. For example, you can always blame the other country, the enemy, and so on. They are keeping us back. They are not. They're against us, and so on and so on. There is always reserve enemy there. And the other is for the, so to say, home use. You can use it at home. Nationalism is very good in that respect, and nobody actually wants to get rid of it. The alternative would be reconciliation, going forward, and building civil society, trying to forward this democracy, which is not really democracy, because all post-communist countries are ruled in very much old-fashioned authoritarian manner. I would just mention one name, but he is, I think, on the top, Viktor Orban, Hungarian Viktor Orban. But the model, he's a model. The models in this or that way are being replicated throughout Eastern Europe. And this is, again, of course, shows two things: that it cannot be changed overnight. Even a political system, regime you change, but the way people are used to authoritarianism, even the other generation, okay, Viktor Orban falls in between, but even the younger generation, they are still used to this non-democratic authoritarian more or less way. And for authoritarians, the nationalism is it's very good thing, very good means of manipulation, and nationalism of the old type. We are not talking about modern anthropological definition of nationalism as a construct. It is more like a piece of stone where everything is cast in. So color of ice, you cannot change it. So this is how I see that very complex question that you put to me.
When was the first moment after 1989 that you felt like it was not going to be okay in Yugoslavia, that something ominous was happening?
After 1989, well, at the same time, there were completely different process going on, unexpected, I might say, than in the rest of Europe. So, I mean, Berlin Wall is falling, everybody is happy, and we are concerned, we are nervous, because there is something happening in the country, Yugoslavia, where nationalisms are for quite some time already very strong, especially Serbian nationalism, of course, as reaction, Albanian nationalism, Kosovo, then also the other nationalisms all over Yugoslavia. And so people are dealing with this question: is actually at that point what is being thought about and discussed is Yugoslavia going to survive, or is it going to fall apart? Mind you, nobody ever, I think, thought that Yugoslavia would collapse and in blood. There was, I think, in nobody's thought of ordinary citizens or my generation that there is any possibility of blood. So we are living in another world at that point. And we are not concerned, that we are not so paying so much attention to what is happening in Europe at that moment. This is what I think.
I'm thinking about a conversation we had in New York shortly after Trump was elected, when I was completely hysterical. And I don't know if you remember this, but you were saying, no, it's okay. Take a deep breath. You know, it took Milosevic a couple years to convince us we wanted to kill one another. It wasn't, you know, from one day to the next. You have time to get your kids out. And I thought about that again, because another mutual friend of ours from Belgrade, Ivan Vevoda, said to me, he was in Washington during the 2016 elections. And he said all of his American friends and colleagues said, like, okay, yes, this is not a good moment, but don't worry, he can't possibly win. It's going to pass. You know, things will settle down. And later, Ivan said to me, you know, I was in Belgrade when Milosevic came to power, and I could feel that Trump was going to win. Like there was something there. There was something he understood.
Yeah,
What have you understood from that experience?
I don't think that there is a parallel between Trump and Milosevic, but what you see and what he saw, of course, and he was saying the same thing as I did. Why? Because there is what you need is psychological preparation. For every big change, you cannot start the war without years of psychological preparation. I don't think you were preparing for war in the United States, but things were getting worse and worse and worse. Yes, of course, and this is why you were so very nervous. But in Yugoslavia, something else was happening. We saw political preparations, we saw escalation of nationalism, but still, I think the feeling was, yes, it's very bad, but again, not the war. So when the war started, then I think it was. It was like it was a really, really big shock, and especially in Bosnia, as you know, in Bosnia, where people are very mixed. It is Croats who are Catholic and Serbs who are Orthodox and Muslims. We call them Muslim, but they're Bosniaks. We used to call them Muslims, but they're actually Bosniak, of which there are secular Bosniaks, of which some are of a Muslim religion traditionally. So you think, okay, if these three nationalities are living on the same floor of the building, are they going then to kill each other? That's impossible. Well, this is exactly what happened. So you do not see, I do not see the parallel, but I see, and it is for people who went through that, like Ivan and me, the atmosphere, how is it being built up? You recognize the most of all rhetorics, and I think this is, you know, this kind of this is the rhetorics that disseminates on purpose, disseminates fear, and this is what I think both have seen and recognized, and again in Trump when he was taking power.
Let me then ask another question connected to Bosnia. One of the things you tell, one of the stories you tell in that book, briefly in the new book, is about witness B14-1, a survivor of the Srebrenica massacre, who tells the story about, he was 17 years old, I think, at the time, facing the firing squad, and how people were pleading to be given water before they were shot. And how he was saying that I just felt sad that I was going to die thirsty. You know, and you tell that story in the context, you know, both of talking about grappling with historical memory, you know, and a desire not to confront the past, but also the role that sensory details play. You know, the role of the detail in the recollection of the past. And you're talking about the Jasenovac concentration camp, you know, and about how people were killed there, but they weren't killed by the Nazis, they were killed by the Croatians, and they were killed in different ways. They were killed with different tools. There was a big wooden hammer, for instance. And one of the things I'd like to ask you to talk a bit about, because I know there are lots of people aspiring to write books in the audience, in writing books in different ways. What is the significance, not just of the overall rhetoric and the ideological framework of memory, but of the sensory details? You know, how do you pull out the sensory details, and what role can those sensory details, the one sentence that the unnamed witness says about Srebrenica, or you talk about how you remember the moment when you heard about Jan Palach's self-immolation on Wenceslas Square in January 1969, and this kind of inhuman screaming, you know, as he was burning, you know, and the moment of thinking about that pain, you know, and that scream, like just little flashes, these little moments. How do you grapple with that, both conceptually, and how do you grapple with that as a writer? You know, what does it mean to try to make people face what they don't want to face by this use of details?
Let me just go back to the witness, and he was witness at the ICTY International Criminal Court for Tribunal for former Yugoslavia from Srebrenica. It is fascinating. I will never forget listening to and reading his witnessing. Why? He survived mass killing, he survived genocide, and there were indeed several people who survived killing in Srebrenica. It's almost unimaginable, but it happened. And I mean, always somebody survives. It's fantastic. I think the best way actually to remember Srebrenica, in my view, is to remember such little elements, to remember names of the people, to remember their witnessing. And I would like to use this opportunity, if you don't mind, to point at one film that I think everybody should see. It was recently mentioned because it was in the race for Oscar for the best foreign film. And it is directed by a young Bosnian director, Jasmila Žbanić. The name of the film is Quo Vadis Aida, and it is the Srebrenica genocide that is the topic of that film. And I would recommend everybody, because sometimes, and I have to recognize that with a heavy heart, it's that pictures can speak better than words. It's something very impressive. And then going to the question, how do you, basically you're asking me, how do I write? I would say I write from the bottom up, so it's not very difficult. So for me, I see some very small details, and then I build stories. I see sort of a bigger pattern in them. Sometimes perhaps I'm wrong, I don't know. But I always start with a detail, which I think it's the fiction writer in me, because you can't write fiction without focusing on many, many details. You can't be abstract. You can't tell the story without the voice, without the face, without the story, the narrative itself, and so on. So to me, it's more of so to say a problem to decide, is this topic that I would like to address, am I writing then a collection of essays about it, some small story, reportage, some journalist form, or am I going then to choose it for some other, I don't know, for a novel or something? So it's a matter of material itself. I tell you the example of the book which might interest some of you. It's a book about mass rapes of women in Bosnia. It's called S, or A Novel About the Balkans in America. And in the United States, it's called As If I Was Not There. And it deals with real cases of numbers are always a problem, but right now, more than 30,000 women raped in camps during the Bosnian War, 41, 45, 42, 45, sorry. And sorry, did I say 42, 45? 92,
yeah.
And yeah, the historians will kill me. But it's then I have read quite some witnessing accounts, which were professionally collected by the agencies right away, right at the time when they came out first time by the end of the 1992 from Bosnia to Croatia. I spoke to some of them. I have read a lot of material at the ICTY, and I had in mind a completely different book. I thought it's going to be a book of witnessing accounts. Mind you, the year is now 1993. This would be maybe even very first book of such accounts. And then I'm thinking about that, reading these accounts, and I will say now something very terrible, and please, but it has its own psychological explanation. The more you read it, the more boring it becomes. Not even boring. The word is not boring. You become saturated with that. You can't read it anymore. And it's very repetitive. So what am I going to do with this material? What I thought, no, this is not a good way to do it. The better way to do it, out of all these people, these women who were raped and their experiences, create something that is not going to be a fiction, it's going to be faction, it's going to be a novel based on fact. So then I wrote a book where I have one character. The character is only named S, as in a camp, in every camp you lose your identity. That's how it is. And then, but every detail that I use in this, how they wash, what they eat, what happens to them, every detail is from these witnessing accounts. So you have a fictional character, but everything what happened to her had really happened. And that, I think, was much better received by the public and reached much further than reading a book of witnessing accounts. Because the human being, a reader, cannot stand repetition of this horror, cannot consume it, cannot read it, cannot take it in. So this is how, from the, so to say, how you can use details in completely different way, but always the details are actually most important. As you know, devil is in details. No?
Yes. Well, I will just ask one more question, and then I will invite other people to ask questions. You can ask questions in this little Q&A function. I think you can type them in, and then I can read at least a couple of them. One of the chapters of your book, which is too complex to summarize, but is very, it's amusing, but it's not amusing, and it's about property and what happens to property, in former Yugoslavia. And it becomes this kind of almost absurdist, would be a satire if it weren't completely true, with pieces
of property. In my view, more Kafkian.
Yes, no, you're right. It's completely Kafkaesque, in which, very small pieces of a couple feet here and there are divided between 15 different property owners. But one of the things you tease out, and one of the questions you ask then, is, when do wars really end? How do wars live on, and when do they really end? And do they really end? And what can we use property?
No, it's connected with the first question, of course, because if if I myself think that the war starts when we no longer remember names of the victims, which I think it's correct definition of the beginning of the war, it's not the same for the end of the war. I do not think when it ends, because in my experience in my life, I have not experienced the end of the war. I did not experience reconciliation. I did not experience proper history written by historians to tell me what had really happened in communism and in the war, in the collapse of the Yugoslavia, in wars that finished Yugoslavia, what is happening with the truth, because everybody, as if, the truth somehow disappear. So, and one of the traces, so to say, not only of the war, but generally of the past is property, land property. Land property, I think, was the last time properly registered here in this part of the world during Austro-Hungarian Empire. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed after the First World War, it's more than 100 years now, right? The books that they kept, the land register that they kept is they were never really put in a proper order, because you had nationalization, appropriation, all kind of state intervention into the ownership of land. And then a lot of, for example, here where I am at the moment in Istria, you had all this problem of esuli, of people who left this part of the country because they were either belonging to Italian minority, or they were associated with, in some way, like helping or working, and so again considered enemy. So before before Tito's army marched in, they left the country, left the houses, left the land, and it turned out to be absolutely an enormous, huge problem, and it is, I don't think, completely resolved until today. So yes, I mean, we are now speaking about the Second World War, and we are not even speaking about these wars that happened recently in former Yugoslavia. And judging by what is happening in the books, it's still not over. Judging what is happening with history books, it's still not very clear. And there is not enough, I think our societies are not strong enough. They're not democratic enough. We do not have a critical number of people who are standing up for truth and for generally for truth and democracy and freedom and all of these beautiful values, because you have to build them. You build them slowly in such societies. So I do not have an answer to that question, unfortunately.
The first question I have here is from Michael Alpert, who is a phenomenal klezmer musician and an old friend of mine, and somebody who you met, I think, around the time that I was born half a century ago, a very, very long time ago, when he was wandering around Yugoslavia. And he is asking if you can, I don't think he's spoken to you since then, so it was about half a century ago. Can you speak to any connections and or differences between events in Croatia in 1972? I'm not sure what happened exactly in 1972 and what took place in the late 80s and 90s.
Spring. It's a political event, and it's a very problematic still in our history, but it actually wasn't much more than a group of Croatian political politicians, the top politician, but local Croatian, right? Demanding more independence from the central power, so to say. And that became very problematic, and Tito cut it very shortly, and there were quite a lot of young people involved, students, some of them went to prison, and so on, so on. But more than that, I cannot say, because it did not. But when you think that it wasn't freedom and democracy that they were asking for in the meaning of the word that we are using now, but only more freedom from the central communist power, then you think, oh my God, is it really what it was? Yeah.
Okay, I have a second question. Oh, this is, what are the dreams of young Croats?
Oh, I think most of young Croats dream to go abroad and work there and make money. Why? Because it's very hard to get a job. Most of young Croats, especially those who studied humanistics like you, they cannot find a job. I will tell you only one example. There is a bookstore that opened recently, and this bookstore was opening. The bookstore is a big thing, I mean, because they're mostly closing. But this bookstore was looking for 2 people to sell books, right? And how do you call it, competition asked for adequate education, and it was only high school. You don't need more than that. However, about over 800 young people, how do you say, appeared in this competition. Mm-hmm. Most of them were eliminated because they didn't fulfill all the conditions. But then about 100, I think, and 70 remain. Then the friend who was opening this bookstore asked for a commission to help, and made a special commission to what to do, because they were all overqualified. They were doctors of sciences, of humanistic. No, there were people who wrote books. There were people who did have some experience, made some name in that. And to choose between these people, 2 people who are going to sell books, was extremely, extremely painful and difficult, as it is to think that more than 150,000 people, young people, mind you, Croatia is a very small country. It has 4 million people now. And young people, and this is the problem that we did not address, but it is luckily addressed in the book. And this is for the first time in Eastern Europe, we experience brain drain. It's not poverty that takes people out like 100 years ago. This is not peasants who are leaving because they can't live off their land. There is no corn, there is no wheat, or so. But these are highly qualified people, people with university, people with PhD, especially doctors, especially people from physics, biology, all these natural sciences. They are leaving in great numbers. And it's virtually so that countries like Romania are almost without doctors. Here we don't have nurses enough, and so on. So it is the brain drain phenomena from east to west, the most qualified people going to the west to find work. So young Croatian people, unfortunately, are dreaming about job, and they know that there is not much chance that they will get it here, especially not only because there are no jobs, but because jobs are distributed in a particular way, which we call corruption.
I think we have time for one more question, and I might try to kind of merge a couple of these themes here into a question. So going back to the Croatian Spring in '72, was that a kind of foreshadowing, or does that have anything to do with what happened in the late 80s and 90s? And if so, do you have any sense for why did that kind of gruesome ethnic cleansing break out in Yugoslavia and not in the Soviet Union, for instance? What was particular at that moment?
Well, I think that so-called Croatian Spring has to do, which was, at that moment, it was defined and also judged and politically as Croatian nationalism, as a rise of Croatian nationalism. And in Yugoslavia, Tito didn't want any nationalism. So, so there was this, I think, some kind of opposition, nationalist opposition, that many of young men that were considered to be nationalist left Yugoslavia and started to live abroad. As I said, some ended up in prison. So, for example, brothers Veselica, they are from that time. But on the other hand, you had Mika Tripalo, who was one of the leaders of the spring in Croatian Spring, who then became very, very active in the right after 1989 and the political processes towards independence in Croatia then. So I would not directly connect that movement because it was not a movement, it was a political event to the war many more years afterward. What was particular for Yugoslavia was that it was somehow it paid the price for not being totalitarian like Russia, but authoritarian. We did have Tito, but the whole model was, I would say, authoritarian, not totalitarian. And it didn't generate the opposition. My generation did not oppose. We were, what I say, we were pleased with the crumbles from the table, and we did not feel like, for example, Václav Havel or or others, leaders of the opposition, Michnik and so on. There was no Václav Havels and Michnik. We were happy children in Yugoslavia, and we didn't want anything. We already had money, we traveled, we had passports. We imagined that we had enough freedom, and I'm speaking in the name of the generation. So we didn't feel the need to create an alternative democratic, either movement or a political group or anything when the war started, let me put it this way, when the change, 1989, when communism started to collapse, the only people, and here there might be a connection between Croatian Spring and that time, were nationalists. They were only people who were prepared to take on and start the war. I mean, this is how it happened, but they were only political power strong enough to do something. The opposition, like in Slovenia, civil opposition, there were no people who could take over and start something. There was no enough idea that we are some kind of a democratic alternative. We were not democratic alternative, but they were nationalists, they were strong, and they took over, and then happened what happened.
Oh. Oh, we are unfortunately out of time. I'm generally very bad about keeping time, but now that we're on the internet and the time is kind of glaring at me, I'm trying to be better at it. There are many more questions. Maybe I can ask Christina to save them so that you can at least at your leisure see what they are and what people are thinking about as they're listening to you and reading you. Slavenka, thank you so much for joining us. I wish I could be seeing you in person.
Thank you for giving me a chance to talk.
Oh.
That was really great talking to you. And yeah, it would be nice to have more time, but maybe another time.
Yes, hopefully another time and another time in person. I hope to see all of our listeners at some point in person. I see that I know many of them and many of them I don't know, but hopefully the plague will end and we will have live conversations.
I tell you, COVID is terrible. COVID is terrible. I'm really lucky to survive. Stay safe, please.
Mhm.